The photograph was discovered in a safety deposit box in a Chicago bank in March of 1986, 40 years after Al Capone's death. The box had been rented under a false name, Mary Josephine Coughlin, the maiden name of Capone's wife May, and had gone unclaimed for decades until the bank, during a routine audit of abandoned accounts, finally drilled the lock. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed to the color of old bone, was a single 8x10 photograph. The image showed a young woman in her early 20s, dark-haired and striking, holding an infant wrapped in an elaborate christening gown. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the camera, as if she had been caught mid-motion, but the baby stared directly at the lens with eyes that seemed too knowing for a child so young. On the back of the photograph, written in fading ink, were 3 lines. Chicago, 1931, the arrangement. Never speak of this. Beside the photograph was a ledger, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with meticulous entries spanning 15 years. Each entry recorded a date, a dollar amount, and a single word: silence. The amounts ranged from $500 to $5,000, paid monthly without fail from 1931 to 1946. The final entry, dated January 25, 1947, exactly 1 week after Al Capone's death from cardiac arrest, contained no dollar amount. Instead, someone had written in a different hand, "The contract is fulfilled. We were never here." This is not a story about gangsters hiding money. This is not a story about Al Capone's legendary brutality or his empire of bootlegging and vice. This is a story about what happens when power, shame, and maternal desperation collide in the shadows of America's most notorious crime family. This is a story about a woman who could not bear children, a burlesque dancer who became a vessel for another woman's dreams, and a child who grew up not knowing his own name. This is a story about the lies we tell to protect the people we love, and the price we pay to keep those lies alive. Before we continue, I want you to do something for me. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because stories like this, stories that have been buried for decades, stories that challenge everything we think we know about history's most infamous figures, these are the stories I live to tell. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Which city? Which state? Because this story, like so many stories of the American underworld, is a story about place, about neighborhoods and loyalties, and the invisible borders that separated one world from another. To understand how May Capone, the devout Catholic wife of America's most wanted criminal, came to orchestrate an arrangement so secret that it would remain hidden for 4 decades after her husband's death. We must go back to a bitter winter in 1918, to a small apartment in Brooklyn, where a young Irish-American woman named Mary Josephine Coughlin was learning what it meant to be barren in a world that measured a woman's worth by her ability to bear children. May Coughlin met Alphonse Capone at a dance in Carroll Gardens when she was 19 years old and he was 18. He was a small-time street tough with a vicious scar across his left cheek, a souvenir from a bar fight over an insult he'd delivered to a woman whose brother carried a knife. She was the daughter of a construction worker, a girl who had been raised to believe that marriage and motherhood were the twin pillars of female virtue, the only paths to respectability in a neighborhood where respectability was the currency that mattered most. They were married on December 30th, 1918, in a small ceremony at St. Mary Star of the Sea Church. May was already 3 months pregnant. The baby, a son they named Albert Francis but called Sonny, was born on December 4th, 1918, just 4 days before the wedding. The timing was scandalous, but May's pregnancy legitimized the marriage in the eyes of the church and the neighborhood. She had fulfilled the first and most essential duty of a Catholic wife, she had given her husband a son. But Sonny's birth was difficult. The labor lasted 18 hours and ended with forceps and hemorrhaging that left May weak and pale for months afterward. When she finally recovered enough to return to church, she lit candles and prayed for another child, a daughter this time, a little girl she could dress in lace and teach to say the rosary. She prayed every day for a year, and then another year, and then another. By 1925, when Al Capone had risen to become the undisputed boss of Chicago's South Side, controlling an empire of speakeasies, brothels, and gambling dens that generated $60 million a year, May had consulted 7 different doctors. The diagnosis was always the same. Scarring from Sonny's birth had made her uterus inhospitable. She would never carry another child. In a world where a woman's identity was inseparable from her role as mother, this diagnosis was not merely a medical fact. It was a kind of death. May stopped going to the women's luncheons at the church. She stopped attending the christenings and first communions that filled the social calendar of Chicago's Italian and Irish Catholic communities. She spent her days in the sprawling Prairie Avenue mansion that Al had purchased for her, a 22-room limestone fortress with stained glass windows and a pipe organ in the parlor. And she filled the empty rooms with religious statues and crucifixes, as if sanctity could compensate for the children who would never run through those halls. Al Capone, for his part, never reproached her. He doted on Sonny, who had contracted a severe ear infection as a child that left him partially deaf and prone to seizures. Al paid for the best specialists, the most experimental treatments, the private tutors who could work with a boy whose disability made him an outsider, even in a family of outlaws. But May knew. She knew with the certainty that comes from years of reading a man's silences, that Al wanted more children. He wanted a dynasty. He wanted sons who could carry his name and daughters he could spoil and protect. And she could not give him that. The shame of her barrenness became a kind of obsession. She began to see her inability to conceive as a moral failure, a punishment from God for having married a man whose fortune was built on sin. She increased her charitable donations. She attended Mass every morning at 6 a.m., kneeling in the front pew with her rosary beads wrapped so tightly around her fingers that they left marks. She commissioned a private chapel in the mansion's east wing and filled it with relics she purchased from dealers in Rome and Jerusalem. A splinter of wood said to be from the True Cross, a vial of water from the Jordan River, a fragment of bone from St. Francis of Assisi. But no amount of prayer or penance could change the medical reality. By 1930, May was 33 years old, and the window for motherhood was closing. That was the year she met Vivian Delaney. Vivian Delaney was 22 years old, a burlesque dancer who performed under the stage name Violet LaRue at the Green Mill Cocktail Lounge on North Broadway. The Green Mill was one of Al Capone's favorite haunts, a jazz club where he kept a private booth with a secret door that led to a tunnel system connecting to the street outside, an escape route in case of a raid. Vivian had been working at the Green Mill for 6 months when May Capone first saw her perform. The show that night was typical of the era, a mix of comedy sketches, jazz numbers, and dance routines that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for public performance. Vivian's act was one of the more risque offerings. She performed a fan dance, a routine made famous by Sally Rand, in which she used oversized ostrich feather fans to create the illusion of nudity while remaining technically clothed in a flesh-colored bodysuit. The dance was all suggestion and shadow, a performance of concealment and revelation that drove the men in the audience wild. But what caught May's attention was not the dance itself. It was the moment after the performance, when Vivian came out to mingle with the crowd. May watched as Vivian moved through the room with a kind of grace that seemed at odds with the tawdriness of her profession. She was tall and slender, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of amber. She laughed easily, but there was something guarded in her expression, something that suggested she was performing even when she was off stage. May approached her at the bar. The conversation that followed was brief and unremarkable on the surface, a compliment on the performance, a polite exchange about the weather and the music. But May left the club that night with a strange sense of possibility, a feeling she could not yet articulate, but that would, over the following months, crystallize into a plan so audacious and so morally complex that it would require the full weight of Al Capone's power and influence to execute. She began attending Vivian's performances regularly. She sent gifts to the dressing room, expensive perfumes, silk stockings, jewelry that Vivian could never have afforded on a dancer's salary. She invited Vivian to lunch at the mansion, ostensibly to discuss a potential charitable donation to a fund for out-of-work performers. Vivian, who had grown up in poverty on the West Side and who understood that opportunities like this did not come without strings attached, accepted the invitation with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The lunch took place in the mansion's conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with orchids and ferns that May tended herself. They ate chicken salad and drank iced tea, and May asked Vivian about her life, where she had grown up, whether she had family, what her dreams were beyond the stage. Vivian answered carefully, revealing just enough to seem forthcoming, without exposing the full truth of her circumstances. The truth was this: Vivian Delaney was the daughter of a seamstress and a dock worker who had died in a warehouse fire when she was 14. Her mother had remarried a man who drank and who had made it clear that Vivian was no longer welcome in the house once she turned 16. She had been on her own ever since, moving from rooming house to rooming house, taking whatever work she could find. Burlesque was not a dream, it was survival. May listened to Vivian's story with an expression of sympathy that seemed genuine, and then she made her proposal. She began indirectly, talking about her own inability to have more children, about the emptiness she felt, about the way the mansion's rooms seemed to echo with the absence of the family she had imagined. She spoke about Al's desire for more children, about the way he looked at other men's sons and daughters with a longing he tried to hide. And then, with a directness that took Vivian by surprise, May said, "I want to hire you to carry a child for me." The arrangement she proposed was this: Vivian would be artificially inseminated with Al Capone's seed, a procedure that was experimental in 1930 but not unheard of, performed by a discreet doctor who owed Al a favor and who understood the consequences of refusing. Vivian would carry the pregnancy to term in a private residence outside the city, far from the eyes of the press and the rival gangs who would see a Capone heir as a target. When the baby was born, May would take the child and raise it as her own. Vivian would receive $50,000, a fortune in 1930, enough to leave Chicago, to start a new life, to never have to dance in a burlesque hall again. In exchange, she would sign a contract agreeing to never reveal the child's true parentage, to never contact the Capone family, to never speak of the arrangement to anyone. Vivian's first reaction was disbelief. Her second was fear. She understood, even in that moment, that this was not a request. This was an offer from the wife of Al Capone, a man who had built his empire on violence and intimidation, a man who had ordered the deaths of dozens of people who had crossed him or threatened his interests. To refuse would be to make an enemy of the most powerful criminal organization in America. But there was something else, too. There was the money. $50,000. Enough to disappear, to reinvent herself, to become someone other than Violet LaRue, the burlesque dancer who took off her clothes for men who saw her as nothing more than a body to be consumed. Enough to buy respectability, or at least the illusion of it. She asked for time to think. May gave her 3 days. Vivian spent those 3 days walking the streets of Chicago, trying to imagine what it would mean to carry a child for 9 months, to give birth, and then to hand that child over to another woman and walk away. She thought about her own mother, who had loved her fiercely until the day she remarried and chose her new husband over her daughter. She thought about the men who came to the green mill every night, who threw money at her and shouted crude suggestions, who saw her as an object to be used and discarded. She thought about the future she could have with $50,000, a future in which she would never have to perform again, never have to smile at men she despised, never have to pretend that her body was not her own. On the 3rd day, she returned to the mansion and told May Capone that she would do it. The insemination took place in a private clinic on the north side, in a building that had no sign and no listed address. The doctor was a man named Greenberg, a German immigrant who had studied medicine in Berlin and who had fled to America after a scandal involving an illegal abortion. He performed the procedure in a sterile room with white tile walls and a single examination table. Vivian lay on the table with her legs in stirrups, while Dr. Greenberg used a syringe to deposit Al Capone's semen into her cervix. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. May was not present. Al was not present. Vivian was alone with the doctor and a nurse who never spoke and who avoided making eye contact. When it was over, Dr. Greenberg told her to rest for an hour and then sent her home with instructions to return in 2 weeks for a pregnancy test. The test was positive. Vivian moved into a house in Lake Forest, a wealthy suburb north of Chicago, in her 2nd month of pregnancy. The house was a modest 2-story colonial with a garden and a view of Lake Michigan. It was furnished simply but comfortably, and it came with a housekeeper named Mrs. Kowalski, a Polish woman in her 60s who had been instructed to attend to Vivian's needs and to report any unusual activity to May Capone. Vivian spent the next 7 months in near total isolation. She was not allowed to leave the house except for medical appointments, which were conducted by Dr. Greenberg in a private office in Evanston. She was not allowed to receive visitors. She was not allowed to make phone calls. Mrs. Kowalski did the shopping and the cooking, and the 2 women developed a routine of polite but distant coexistence. They ate meals together in silence. They listened to the radio in the evenings. They did not discuss the pregnancy. May visited once a month, always unannounced, always arriving in a car with tinted windows driven by one of Al's men. She would sit with Vivian in the parlor and ask about her health, about whether she was eating enough, about whether she needed anything. She brought gifts, maternity clothes, books, a music box that played Brahms' Lullaby. She never asked Vivian how she felt about the arrangement. She never acknowledged the strangeness of the situation, the surreal intimacy of 2 women bound together by a contract that turned pregnancy into a transaction. Vivian, for her part, tried not to think about the future. She tried not to imagine what it would feel like to hold the baby and then hand it over. She tried to focus on the money, on the life she would build once this was over. But as her belly grew and the baby began to move inside her, she found it harder and harder to maintain that emotional distance. She began to talk to the baby when she was alone, whispering to it in the dark, telling it stories about the life it would have, the mother who would love it, the father who would protect it. She told herself that she was doing this for the baby, that she was giving it a chance at a life she could never provide. The labor began on a cold night in December of 1931. Mrs. Kowalski called Dr. Greenberg, who arrived within the hour with a nurse and a bag of medical supplies. The birth took place in the upstairs bedroom, on a bed that had been covered with rubber sheets and towels. Vivian labored for 14 hours. She screamed and wept and begged for it to be over, and when the baby finally emerged, a boy, healthy and squalling, Dr. Greenberg cut the cord and handed the infant to the nurse, who wrapped him in a blanket and carried him out of the room before Vivian could hold him. May arrived the next morning. She came into the bedroom where Vivian lay, pale and exhausted, and she sat on the edge of the bed and took Vivian's hand. She thanked her. She told her that she had done a beautiful thing, a holy thing, that God would bless her for her sacrifice. And then she handed Vivian an envelope containing $50,000 in cash and a train ticket to Los Angeles, departing that afternoon. Vivian left the house in Lake Forest without ever seeing the baby again. She took the train to Los Angeles and checked into a hotel under a false name. She spent the first week in a fog of grief and exhaustion, unable to eat or sleep, haunted by the memory of the baby's cry, the brief glimpse she had caught of his face before the nurse took him away. She thought about going back, about demanding to see him, about breaking the contract and exposing the whole arrangement. But she knew what would happen if she did. She knew that Al Capone did not tolerate betrayal, that the $50,000 was not just payment, but also insurance, a reminder that she had been bought and that the price of speaking out would be her life. So she stayed silent. She used the money to reinvent herself. She changed her name to Victoria Lane and enrolled in secretarial school. She got a job at a law firm in downtown Los Angeles, working as a receptionist and then as a legal secretary. She rented a small apartment in Pasadena and filled it with books and plants and tried to build a life that had nothing to do with Burlesque or Chicago or the baby she had carried and lost. But she never stopped thinking about him. She never stopped wondering what he looked like, whether he was happy, whether May Capone loved him the way she had promised. And every year on his birthday, she lit a candle and said a prayer for the boy she would never know. May Capone named the baby Albert Francis Capone Jr., the same name as her first son, Sonny. She told everyone that she had been pregnant in secret, that she had spent the last months of her pregnancy in seclusion to avoid the stress and scrutiny that came with being Al Capone's wife. She showed the baby to the family at a christening ceremony held in the private chapel of the Prairie Avenue mansion, and no one questioned the story. No one dared. The baby, who May called Frankie to distinguish him from Sonny, was raised as May's biological son. Al doted on him, just as he doted on Sonny, but there was a special intensity to his affection for Frankie, a kind of pride that seemed to go beyond the normal bond between father and son. He had Frankie's birth certificate altered to list May as the mother, and he paid off the hospital staff and the city clerk to ensure that there was no record of Vivian Delaney or the house in Lake Forest or the arrangement that had brought Frankie into the world. For 15 years, the secret held. Frankie grew up in the mansion on Prairie Avenue, surrounded by luxury and violence, by the contradictions of a family that attended Mass every Sunday and ran the most ruthless criminal organization in America. He was a quiet child, thoughtful and observant, with his mother's dark hair and his father's intense gaze. He was close to Sonny, who treated him with a protective tenderness that suggested he understood, on some level, that Frankie was different, that he needed to be shielded from the brutality of the world they inhabited. But in 1946, when Frankie was 15 years old, Al Capone died. The empire he had built collapsed almost immediately. The men who had been loyal to him scattered or were absorbed into other organizations. The mansion on Prairie Avenue was sold to pay off debts and legal fees. May moved to a smaller house in Florida, taking Sonny and Frankie with her, and tried to live quietly, to fade into obscurity. It was in Florida, in the weeks after Al's death, that May told Frankie the truth. She did it because she believed he had a right to know. She did it because she was dying. She had been diagnosed with lung cancer and given 6 months to live, and she could not bear the thought of taking the secret to her grave. She did it because she loved him and because she wanted him to understand that he had been wanted, that he had been chosen, that his existence was not an accident but the result of a desperate woman's longing for a child. She told him about Vivian Delaney. She told him about the arrangement, the insemination, the house in Lake Forest, the $50,000. She told him that Vivian had carried him and given birth to him and then walked away, that she had kept the secret for 15 years, that she had sacrificed her own chance at motherhood so that May could have the family she craved. Frankie listened in silence. When May finished, he asked only one question. Where is she now? May did not know. She had not kept track of Vivian after the arrangement ended. She had not wanted to know. The contract had been clear. No contact, no communication, no acknowledgement. Vivian Delaney had ceased to exist the moment she handed over the baby. But Frankie could not let it go. He spent the next year searching for Vivian. He hired private investigators. He combed through city directories and employment records. He traveled to Los Angeles and walked the streets of Pasadena, showing Vivian's photograph, the one from the safety deposit box, the one May had kept hidden all those years, to shopkeepers and landlords and anyone who might remember a dark-haired woman who had arrived in 1931 with a suitcase full of cash and a new name. He found her in 1947, living in a small apartment above a bakery on Colorado Boulevard. She was 40 years old, still beautiful but worn down by the years, by the weight of the secret she had carried. When Frankie knocked on her door and introduced himself, she did not speak. She simply stared at him, at the face that was a mirror of the man whose child she had borne, and she began to cry. They sat together in her apartment for hours. Frankie asked her questions, why she had agreed to the arrangement, whether she had ever regretted it, whether she had thought about him over the years. Vivian answered as honestly as she could. She told him about the money, about the desperation that had driven her to accept May's proposal. She told him about the grief she had felt after the birth, the way it had hollowed her out and left her unable to form attachments, unable to trust anyone. She told him that she had thought about him every day, that she had imagined 1,000 different versions of his life, that she had prayed for him even though she no longer believed in God. And then she asked him a question. Do you hate me? Frankie thought about it for a long time before he answered. He thought about May, who had raised him with love and devotion, who had given him everything she could despite the shame and secrecy that had defined her life. He thought about Al, who had been a monster to the world, but a father to him, who had held him and played with him and told him stories about the old country. He thought about Vivian, who had carried him in her body and then given him up, who had lived with the loss of him for 16 years. No, he said finally. I don't hate you. I just wish I had known sooner. They stayed in contact after that. Frankie visited Vivian whenever he could, and they built a relationship that was not quite mother and son, but something else, something undefined and fragile. Vivian never asked to be acknowledged publicly. She never tried to claim him or to insert herself into his life in any way that would disrupt the family he had known. She was content to be a presence on the margins, a woman who had once carried him and who now, in the twilight of her life, could know him as a person rather than as a memory. May Capone died in 1968, 22 years after Al. She was buried beside him in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in a plot surrounded by other members of the Capone family. Frankie attended the funeral, and so did Vivian, though she stood at a distance and did not approach the grave. She watched as Frankie placed a bouquet of white roses on May's casket, and she thought about the woman who had hired her to carry a child, who had paid her to give up that child, who had loved that child as fiercely as any biological mother could. Vivian Delaney died in 1975 at the age of 67 in a nursing home in Pasadena. Frankie was with her when she passed. He held her hand and told her that she had given him life twice, once when she carried him, and once when she let him go. He told her that he forgave her, that he understood, that he was grateful. After her death, Frankie found the ledger. It had been hidden in a box in her closet, along with the photograph and a stack of letters she had written to him over the years but never sent. The letters were filled with apologies and explanations, with memories of the pregnancy and the birth, with questions about the man he had become. Frankie read them all, and then he placed them in the safety deposit box in Chicago, along with the photograph and the ledger, and he locked them away. He never spoke publicly about the arrangement. He never wrote a memoir or gave an interview. He lived quietly, working as an accountant in Miami, raising a family of his own, and when he died in 2004 at the age of 73, the secret died with him. Or so it seemed. The safety deposit box was discovered in 1986, but its contents were not made public until 2015, when a researcher working on a biography of Al Capone stumbled across a reference to the box in a footnote in a legal document related to the Capone estate. The researcher petitioned the bank to open the box, and when the contents were finally revealed, they ignited a firestorm of speculation and debate. DNA testing confirmed that the baby in the photograph was indeed Al Capone's biological son. Records from the clinic in Evanston corroborated the story of the insemination. Interviews with surviving members of the Capone family, distant cousins and nieces and nephews who had heard rumors but never confirmed them, added layers of detail and context. But the question that remains, the question that no amount of research or DNA testing can answer, is this: was the arrangement a transaction or a tragedy? Was Vivian Delaney a victim or a willing participant? Was May Capone a desperate woman driven by love, or a manipulator who used her husband's power to coerce a young woman into surrendering her body and her child? The truth, like so many truths in the story of the Capone family, is probably somewhere in between. It is a story about women navigating a world that gave them few choices, about the ways in which power and vulnerability intersect, about the lies we tell ourselves to justify the things we do in the name of love. And it is a story about a boy who grew up not knowing his own origin, who spent his life caught between two mothers, two identities, two versions of the truth. A boy who, in the end, chose to honor both women, to forgive them both, to carry their secrets with grace and silence. The photograph remains in the safety deposit box, along with the ledger and the letters. They are artifacts of a time when secrets could be kept, when money could buy silence, when a woman's desperation and another woman's survival could converge in a single hidden life. Maybe the arrangement was a sin. Maybe it was a miracle. Maybe it was both. The question, like the child himself, remains.